We look forward to Graeme explaining this to us.
What did the limestone say to the geologist? Don't take me for granite. Now, I'm going to fulfil every cliche of a sermon by starting with a bad joke. And it happily, as I discovered as I went through, it turned out to be 3 points with a conclusion as well. That bad joke goes back 50 years, believe it or not. I know you couldn't imagine that I would be a nerdy 12-year-old who wrote his own joke book, but I did, and that was one of them. What did the limestone say to the geologist? More formally, we might express the same idea about not taking something for granted with the words, familiarity breeds contempt. In other words, you get so used to something that it doesn't strike you anymore. You don't even notice. How many of us noticed that large white cross on the wall as we came in today? If you're familiar with the building, you get used to the surrounds, but it's part of our life. In our language, we use the word for awful pain. We say it's excruciating. And the heart of that word is crux, cross. 18 countries in the world have a cross on their flag, including our own, which has several, both the Southern Cross, but also those crosses that make up the Union Jack. We're very used to the symbol of the cross, and in fact I did wear my particular one, which I like very much, and it's beautiful. But actually, should the cross be beautiful? Because it certainly wasn't. And it wasn't beautiful in what happened on a cross. And Paul expresses in that reading we heard from the letter to the Corinthians that it was in fact a shocking idea to the people who encountered it, that God would be involved in a cross. It was unheard of. Because the cross, familiar and beautiful as it is to us and part of our life, was a symbol of tyranny, a symbol of oppression. It was a symbol of the way in which a government would punish those who were the outsiders, the criminals, the slaves. They were the ones who were on a cross, and the Persians had invented it, it seems, and the Romans had settled on it as the ultimate means of showing this is what happens when you break away from our rule. As a way of dying, it was awful. Some of you, some years ago, might remember the film The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. 3 hours, was it, of ultimate agony. And by the time I got to the end of watching that and Jesus actually died, I thought, oh my goodness, that's a relief. It was emphasising the physical suffering as well as the spiritual suffering of the cross, almost too much. But leading up to it, there was torture and pain inflicted, as there was for Jesus. And then the very act of being on a cross, nailed probably through the wrists so that your arms were held on the crossbeam, the T shape, you would slowly suffocate, because to breathe, you have to keep pushing up. But you were nailed in a fixed position and your body would sag. Your lungs would fill with air and slowly you would suffocate and eventually die, sometimes days later, of heart failure. It wasn't just the physical agony that made the cross awful. It was the fact that right out there in public, usually outside the city because it was a place of shame, you would end up naked, exposed to the world, all your bodily functions. Remember, you might be 2 days slowly dying. all your bodily functions exposed to everyone, your shame, your agony, front and centre. The cross was a byword for horror. And the Romans did it in public as a way of very publicly saying, this is what happens to you if you disobey us. In 4 BC, there's a record shortly after Herod the Great had died that Varus killed 2,000 men and lined a road in Galilee with them. 2,000 crosses. Can you imagine that? Could we imagine the Sydney Harbour Bridge lined with people slowly dying an agonising death? That's what the cross was. And for that to be upheld then as the great symbol by which God was in the world, saving the world. What a ridiculous story. How could that's why Paul says it's foolishness to the Greeks, those who were non-Jewish, and also to those who were of the Jewish faith. Because for both of them, this was ridiculous. Those who were of the faith that we call the Jewish faith, they were looking to God to come and save them. That was their whole story. They believed that God loved them. They were looking for hope. But that hope would come as the promised one, the Messiah, would come and lead them to freedom and victory and throw off the Romans so that they might worship God in their land, in their temple. That was at heart what the hope of Israel had been. So to worship someone who suffers and dies, this is not triumphant over the enemy. This seems to be the ultimate failure. And not only that, the idea about God in God's essence suffering, that was impossible thought. For God is perfect and good and beyond. And so how could the God who is perfect and good and beyond be brought to a place where that God suffers? And indeed, that same idea that God might be in Jesus, no matter whether you think Jesus is a prophet or the Son of God, that he would suffer and die on a cross, that's still incomprehensible. I have a friend, Ahmed, who I've got to know as a chaplain. He's part of the circle of prison chaplains that I'm working with. And we've had a great time getting to know each other. And one of the things that we intentionally did was I wanted to know what it was how he saw life and what his faith meant, because I observe him to be a very committed and sincere and lovely man. And we got talking about our different beliefs one day, and he said to me, you know, we esteem Jesus as a prophet, but the idea that he could suffer and die, that's impossible. Now, we believe someone else actually died, and Jesus actually, the real Jesus, went straight to heaven because God's prophet could not suffer like that. And then we think of the Roman world, influenced by Greek philosophy. The Romans, the rulers of it all. Tom Holland, who does a podcast called The Rest is History, which I really like, wrote a book called Dominion, where he traces the influence of Christianity on Western thought. And his idea is that it's been much more so influential that it's the very air we breathe. We don't even notice it. Or, you know, like the analogy of a fish swimming in the water doesn't know that it's swimming in water. His idea is that the influence of Christian thinking, and particularly the cross, is so influential that it's become part of our social fabric. And as a historian, and especially someone who's focused very much on the Roman world and the early history, he noted that in the Roman world, Caesar was called the Son of God. And what was that Son of God like? Full of swagger and strength. To quote Command and swagger were the very essence of the cult of the Caesars. And Paul, as he travelled around in what we call the first century, 2,000 years ago, was visiting these towns and cities that were now part of Turkey and then across into Greece. And he would have noticed the statues of the Caesars and the worship, the veneration of Caesar as a son of the gods. Now, if that's what a son of the gods looked like, powerful, venerated, able to command, wealthy, how does this story about the Son of God dying on a cross seem? What utter stupidity! How could that be the heart of the matter, the crux of it all? And yet for Paul, he's so excited because his whole mind had been undone. He'd been part of that Jewish and Roman world. Actually, that was part of his genius. He was able in his first century world to speak to both cultures and actually put the story of Jesus in a way that had such power in that time. And he said, this cross that is utter stupidity and foolishness is in fact God's power for salvation. Or we might say it is the way in which God's salvation comes to us. Now, of course, you immediately think of, well, salvation from what and to what? And that could be a whole other sermon series, couldn't it? But basically, the human predicament is that we are made by God to partner with God in the shaping of the world through connection with God, and therefore shaping a world where there are communities of love, other-centred love. But if we don't connect with God rightly, then that project's doomed from the beginning. And if the outworking of that is that we find ourselves incapable of loving others really, then that project is doomed in a second way. And so God has to do something about that so that we can know God and also become people of other-centred love ourselves. And we can't do that on our own because we're so full of stupid ideas about how to relate to God or who God is. All these ideas that we have to earn our way to God, or that we have to do something, we have to sacrifice something. People used to sacrifice children, didn't they? Because they thought, that's how I can be accepted by God. And when the people of Israel had enough revelation to know that wasn't done, they still found other ways to try and prove that they were worthy of God. And we do that still. And so we don't know who God is, that God actually loves us, and we are unable to love each other. How's God going to fix things? Well, this strange answer is that God comes among us and dies on a cross, and that in some way that we can talk about and theorise about, the very heart, this is the key idea, that God comes among us from the inside out and unmakes things and unleashes love in a new way. And it's through that things become different. We start to picture who God really is. And if it starts to mean something to us, that God actually loves us without us having to prove anything, then bit by bit that unworks in us and we become able more and more to love each other. It's hard to fully capture in words sometimes, and many, many words have been written about the theories of why Christ died and what it achieved. Sometimes it's pictures that help, or C.S. Lewis in the Narnia books, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when he talks about the deep magic at the heart of the universe, that somehow that death of Christ as the innocent one unmakes everything and releases love and life in new ways. I'm very attracted to the idea that in that we see God's love for restoring relationship. Think about this. If I go and insult David, and say awful things about him. His natural response might be to be angry and to want to hurt me back. But if he breaks that cycle of hatred by saying, I will return hatred and I will give back love, what is he doing? He's absorbing it, that hatred that I've poured out, into himself. It's stopping with him. He's literally taking it on himself. And I love that picture of what we see in the cross, where God enters into the human condition and dies and suffers as one of us. It's a way of saying God takes it all into God's self. And the cycle of blame and shame and hatred and punishment is broken. This cross is the power of God for salvation. It might seem stupid and foolish, nonsensical to all our understandings of what power means. That power would be, as we sang earlier, about servant love, and that in that is salvation. Now, the so what of that, of course, is that it means everything's different. If you worship a crucified slave, well, you are what you worship. You begin to value those who are the slaves the least. The Roman world didn't know about charity or concern for the poor. These were all ideas that began to flow out of this idea that God cared so much that became a slave, and therefore the weakest was valued. And in fact, you might see more of God there than you did in the other places. The last shall be first. And so if you have a beautiful cross, or if you see a plain, spare, lovely cross on a wall, if you have occasion to look at the flag of the country we call Australia, stop for a moment and be thankful to God that this symbol, foolish as it is at the heart of everything. It is the power of God for salvation. Amen.